For almost the whole of human history, no one could see the world. Not really, not the way you can tonight with a glowing map in your pocket that shows the whole planet turning beneath you. For thousands of years a person could climb the tallest hill they knew, shade their eyes, and see perhaps 30 kilometers of ground before the land dissolved into haze. That was the edge of the visible world. Everything past it was rumour, a sailor's story, a trader's boast, the shape of a coastline someone else swore they had walked. Nobody had ever looked down on the earth from above. No one had seen the outline of Africa, or the great curl of South America, or the white silence of the far south. Those shapes existed, of course, but no human eye had held them. To draw the world you had to imagine it, to gather 1,000 small glimpses and stitch them into one impossible picture of a thing you could never actually see. Think about how strange that really is. A map maker in an old workshop, bent over a table by candlelight, was trying to draw something no living person had ever witnessed whole. He was working from scraps, a note about how many days it took to sail from one port to another, a traveller's memory of a mountain that looked like a lion, the width of a river guessed, the direction of a coast half remembered. And out of all those fragments, out of all that hearsay and hope, he had to produce a single confident line on a page and say, "Here, this is the shape of the world. It is one of the boldest things a human being has ever tried to do." And most of the time they got it beautifully, understandably wrong. And yet, scattered across the museums and palace vaults of the world, there are a handful of old maps that seem to show more than their makers could possibly have known. Coastlines that had not yet been sailed, continents that had not yet been found, a frozen land at the bottom of the world that no eye had ever seen, drawn centuries before any ship reached it. Maps with a name written on them that shouldn't have existed yet. Maps that split a continent in two exactly where, thousands of years later, machines would find the split hidden under the ice. Look at them too long in the wrong light, and they start to feel like messages. Like someone, somewhere knew. Tonight, we're going to hold 10 of these maps up to the light, one at a time, and look at them slowly. And I promise you they are stranger and more wonderful than any story about aliens or lost super-civilizations. Because the truth of how these maps came to be is quieter than a myth, and in its own way it is far more moving. We're going to travel across roughly 5,000 years to do it. Ink and clay and papyrus and stone. We'll start in the marble halls of an Ottoman palace, with a fragment of gazelle skin, and we'll end on a slab of Bronze Age rock, carved before anyone had thought to write a single word of history down. We'll pass through Renaissance Venice and medieval Korea, through the deserts of Egypt and the deep libraries of Babylon. 10 maps, 10 small miracles of the human mind, and with each one the same soft question turning over and over like a stone in a river. Because here is what I want you to notice as we go. The question is not the one you might expect. It isn't, was there a lost civilization 10,000 years ago with satellites and secret knowledge? That's the easy question, and it's usually the wrong one. The real question, the one that ties all 10 of these maps together, is gentler and much harder. It's this: how did knowledge actually travel? How did a fact about a distant coastline, or the shape of a cape no local ship had ever rounded, make its way across the centuries and end up on a piece of parchment far too early? Did it travel by sea, carried in the memory of sailors who never wrote anything down? Did it move along trade roads whispered from one merchant to the next, mile by dusty mile? Was it copied from an older chart, and that one from an older chart still? The mistakes and the marvels handed down together like an heirloom? Or was it something even simpler and even stranger, a person sitting quietly with what little they knew, reasoning their way toward a coastline they had never seen, and guessing right? That's the mystery. Not a lost people, a lost path. The invisible road that knowledge takes to get from the world into a human hand and then onto a map. Hold that thought in the back of your mind as we go. Some of these 10 maps were made by admirals, some by monks, some by mathematicians, and at least one, near the very end, by someone whose name we will never know, who carved a landscape into stone before the alphabet reached his corner of the world. They lived thousands of years and thousands of miles apart. And yet the thing they were all reaching for was the same. Every one of them was trying to take a piece of the world that was too big to see and make it small enough to hold. That reaching is the real story here. The maps are just where we can still see the fingerprints of it. Before we lower the lights on the first one, let me ask you something, wherever you are. I always find myself wondering where you're listening from tonight. What country? What city? Whether it's dark outside your window the way it's dark for so many of us right now, or whether the sun is up and you've simply found a quiet hour to close your eyes. And what time it is where you are. If you feel like it, leave a comment and tell me the place and the hour. It's a small thing, but there's something lovely about it. Someone drifting off in Manila reads that someone else is drifting off in Sao Paulo, and someone in a farmhouse in Ireland, and someone on a night shift in Toronto, all of us awake and half asleep at the same time, listening to the same old stories. We're scattered right across the turning globe, and for an hour we're in the same quiet room. I like feeling connected to you like that, and if you'd ever like to listen without anything interrupting you, no advertisements, no music, just the voice and the history, you can follow the channel on Spotify. It's there ad-free and music-free, and there's a link waiting in the description whenever you want it. That's all. Now let's get back to the maps. Settle in. Let your shoulders drop. There's nothing you need to do for the next while except drift and listen and let these old pieces of parchment carry you somewhere far away. Because our first map is waiting for us in a city that has been called by 3 names: Byzantium, Constantinople, and now Istanbul. In a palace of tiled courtyards and locked rooms overlooking the water where 2 seas meet. Somewhere in that palace, for centuries, a single fragment of skin lay folded and forgotten. Not paper, not cloth. The prepared hide of a gazelle, thin as a whisper, painted in faded greens and reds and gold. It is only a piece of what it once was, a third perhaps torn from a much larger whole that has never been found. On it, an admiral drew the edges of a world he was still in the middle of discovering. And in the margins, in careful script, he left notes about the older maps he had copied from. Maps that no longer exist, maps we would give almost anything to see, including, he says, one drawn by the hand of Christopher Columbus himself. For 400 years nobody looked at it, and then one day in the 1920s someone did, and what they thought they saw at the bottom of that gazelle skin would start an argument that is still going on tonight. Let's begin there. The year is 1929. The Ottoman Empire is gone, and in its place a young Turkish republic is turning the old Sultan's palace at Topkapi, there on the hill above the Bosphorus in Istanbul, into a museum. And that means sorting. Room after room of it, chests and cabinets and shelves that no one has properly opened in generations. Imagine the dust of it, the quiet. Somewhere in that long, patient work of cataloguing, a German scholar named Gustav Adolf Deissmann is going through a pile of old parchment, and his hand stops on a single sheet. It is that same piece of gazelle skin from a moment ago, weathered, torn along one edge, still holding its faded colour. Only about a third of the original map survives, a jagged offcut roughly 87 by 63 centimetres, about the size of a small tabletop, and along its margins, in careful Ottoman Turkish, someone has written notes. Deissmann reads them, and the name at the bottom is Piri Reis. Let me tell you who he was. Piri Reis, Reis, being a title meaning captain or admiral, was one of the great seafarers of the Ottoman navy. He knew the Mediterranean the way you know the walk from your bed to your door. He'd sailed with his uncle, a famous corsair, raiding and charting the coasts of the known world. And in the year 1513, which in the Islamic calendar was the year 919, he sat down and drew this map, a picture of the whole Atlantic world as it was understood in the first years after Columbus. The coasts of Spain and West Africa on one side, the brand new coasts of the Americas on the other. On this single skin, an admiral drew the edges of a world that was, at that very moment, still being discovered. And here is the part that makes scholars lean in close. In those margin notes, Piri Reis tells you exactly how he made it. He didn't sail all these coasts himself, he copied. He compiled. He says he drew on around 20 older source charts, laid them side by side, and stitched them into one. Some were Portuguese, some were Arab. Some, he writes, were ancient maps going back to the age of Alexander the Great. And one of them, he says, one of his sources, was a map drawn by Christopher Columbus himself. Sit with that for a moment. Columbus's own chart. A map that no longer exists, that no historian has ever found, that vanished somewhere in the 5 centuries since. And yet here, in the hand of an Ottoman admiral, is a note saying, I held it, I copied from it, it was here. That alone would make this fragment one of the most precious objects in the history of exploration, a ghost of a lost map preserved inside a surviving one. How would an Ottoman sailor come to hold a chart belonging to Columbus? Piri Reis has an answer for that too, written right there in the margins. He says the Columbus map came to him through a Spanish sailor, a man captured in a naval battle who had himself been on 3 of Columbus's voyages to the new lands, a prisoner of war carried east across the Mediterranean, and with him a piece of the map that started it all. Whether every detail of that story is exactly true, we can't now prove. But you can see how a chart might travel that way, captured in a fight, carried in a sea chest, changing hands from a Spanish deck to a Turkish one, until its lines end up copied onto gazelle skin in Gallipoli. Knowledge moving the way knowledge really moved in that age, by sea, by trade, and sometimes by force. But that is not what made the Piri Reis map famous. That came later. That came from the bottom of the skin. Because down at the southern edge of the map, below the coast of South America, the land does something strange. It doesn't stop where you'd expect. It bends and it runs on, a long stretch of coastline reaching off toward the east, filled in with mountains and rivers and little drawn creatures. And in 1966, an American professor named Charles Hapgood looked at that southern coast, in a book he called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, and he said something that would echo for the next 60 years. He said, "That is Antarctica. Not just Antarctica, Antarctica without its ice." He and his students poring over the shapes believed the bays and headlands along that bottom coastline matched the real bedrock coastline of Antarctica, the land that lies buried today under nearly 2 miles of ice. The coastline you cannot see, the coastline modern science only mapped in the 20th century using sound and radar. And Piri Reis, or rather the ancient charts he copied from, seemed to have drawn it bare, ice-free, as if someone had stood on that shore when it was green, and looked and drawn what they saw. And I want you to feel why that idea is so seductive, because it truly is. Think about what it would mean. It would mean that long before Piri Reis, long before Columbus, long before the pyramids even, someone with the skill to make an accurate map had sailed to the bottom of the world and charted a continent while it still had rivers and beaches. A lost people, a forgotten age of navigators. Their knowledge passed down chart to chart, copy to copy, across thousands of years, until a fragment of it surfaced in an Istanbul palace, and no one understood what they were holding. Erich von Daniken took the idea further still. folding it into his stories of visitors from the stars who might have mapped the Earth from above. It's a beautiful, cold, thrilling thought. A map that remembers a world older than us. And the claim didn't stay in the pages of a book. In 1965, Hapgood wrote to the United States Air Force, and an officer at a reconnaissance squadron actually wrote back, saying the southern coast seemed to agree with the results of a recent seismic survey of Antarctica made through the ice. Imagine reading that. A map from 1513, quietly matching a modern military survey of a hidden coastline. For a great many people, that letter settled it. It felt like proof. It felt like the kind of thing that keeps you up at night, turning it over, wondering what we've forgotten about our own past. So let's take it seriously, because it deserves to be taken seriously, and then let's look carefully at what the map really shows. So let's do what we're going to do with every map on this list. Let's turn it over gently and look at it in the light and see what's really there. Start with the coastline itself. The people who claim it's Antarctica need it to be a separate continent, a distinct landmass floating down there at the bottom. But that isn't what Reis actually drew. On the map, that southern coast doesn't break off into open sea and start again as something new. It bends, it runs east, and simply continues, connected the whole way, joined without a gap to the coast of South America above it. There is no channel of water between them. It is one unbroken shore, turning the corner and stretching sideways across the bottom of the parchment. And once you know how 16th century map makers worked, that turn tells a very ordinary story. In 1513, no European had sailed the full length of South America. They knew the coast of Brazil, and then the knowledge ran out. Nobody yet knew that the continent tapered to a point at Cape Horn, that you could round the bottom and keep going. So when a cartographer reached the southern edge of what he knew, and he still had parchment left, and he still believed there ought to be more land down there, he did the natural thing. He bent the coast sideways and kept drawing. He ran the unknown Patagonian shore off to the east to fill the space. It's not a memory of Antarctica. It's a map-maker running out of certainty and coastline at the same time, and improvising to fill the sheet. There's another quiet detail that undoes the match, and it's worth noticing. To make Reis's southern coastline up with the real bedrock of Antarctica, you have to ignore where the map actually places it. The bottom of that coast sits only a little way south of the equator, roughly in the latitudes of Argentina, not down near the pole where Antarctica belongs. It's in the wrong place by thousands of miles. To fix that, you'd have to slide it, stretch it, and rotate it until it fit. And if you're allowed to reshape a coastline until it matches, you can make almost any wandering line match almost anything. That's not evidence, that's wishful geometry. The definitive study of all this came in the year 2000, when a historian named Gregory McIntosh published a book simply titled The Piri-Reis Map of 1513. He went through the fragment inch by inch, note by note, comparing it against the other maps of its era. And what he found was not the relic of a lost civilization. It was a superb, but entirely explainable product of its own moment. Every strange feature had a 16th century source. Those little animals and figures drawn along the southern coast weren't observed wildlife. They were the ordinary decorative flourishes cartographers of the day, sprinkled across the unknown parts of the world, the visual equivalent of "here be dragons." The southern coast itself was simply the standard way the men of that age drew a land they'd guessed at but never reached. And then there is the one fact that closes the door, quietly, and without any need to raise your voice. Antarctica is not just cold now, it has been buried in ice for a very, very long time. The last time that continent was ice-free, the last time it had the green shores and open rivers that the claim requires, was more than 10 million years ago. 10 million. There were no humans then. There was no writing, no ships, no ink, no parchment, no hand that could hold a pen. By the time our species existed to draw anything at all, Antarctica had been sealed under white for millions upon millions of years. No one saw it green, no one could have. So the ice-free coastline isn't there. It never was. And here is the thing I want to leave you with, because it isn't a disappointment. It's the opposite. Strip away the lost civilization, and what you're left with is somehow more wonderful, because it's real. Picture Piri Reis again in the year 1513, in a room with 20 different maps spread out around him. Portuguese charts, Arab charts, a lost map in the hand of Columbus. Different scales, different coastlines, different guesses, drawn by different men who had never met. And he reads them all, and he reconciles them, and he stitches them together by hand into a single coherent picture of the Atlantic world, one of the most accurate anyone had yet made. That's the miracle. Not that someone impossibly remembered a frozen continent, but that a human mind could gather 20 fragments of what other people had seen and weave them into one. That remember is the thread running under every map tonight. Not lost secrets. Knowledge. Travelling. Moving from hand to hand. Chart to copied chart. One sailor's coastline becoming another's margin note, until it all comes to rest on a single skin of gazelle in a palace on the Bosphorus. The Piri Reis map isn't a message from a vanished world. It's a record of how the world talks to itself across time. And yet, that southern coast, that bent and guessed-at edge at the bottom of the map, it wasn't the last time a mapmaker would reach for the frozen south and seem to draw more than he could possibly have known. Because the strange thing about that empty white place at the bottom of the earth is that it kept appearing again and again, on maps drawn long before anyone had ever seen it. Piri Reis was only the first. Let me show you the next one. This next one is even lovelier to look at. If the Piri Reis map is a torn fragment, a survivor, a thing pulled out of a palace drawer with its edges gone soft, this one is whole, and it is beautiful, and it was made by a man who thought in numbers. His name was Oronteus, a French mathematician, born in the last years of the 15th century, and when scholars wrote about him in the learned Latin of the day, they turned his name into something grander, Oronteus Finaeus. He taught mathematics in Paris. He wrote about sundials and instruments and the movement of the heavens. And in the year 1531, he sat down and drew the whole world. Now, picture how he chose to draw it. Most of us, when we imagine a world map, imagine a rectangle, a flat grid, the continent spread across it like laundry on a line. But Oronteus did something stranger and softer. He drew the earth as a heart. Cartographers have a word for it, cordiform, from the Latin for heart-shaped, and that is exactly what it looks like. The lines of longitude curve inward and down, sweeping toward a single point at the bottom of the page, so that the entire globe is folded into the shape of a valentine. It is one of the most gorgeous maps of its century. And to a mathematician like Fine, the shape wasn't decoration. It was a clever solution to an impossible problem. How do you take something round, the surface of a sphere, and lay it flat on paper without it lying to you? The heart shape was his answer. Fold the world down to a point. And here is the thing about that point. The point at the bottom of the heart, where all the lines of the map come together and meet. That is the South Pole, the very bottom of the world. And Oronteus did not leave it empty. He filled it with a continent. At the base of his beautiful heart-shaped map, wrapped neatly around the South Pole, sits an enormous landmass. He gave it a name written across it in careful Latin letters. Terra Australis, the southern land. And it is not a vague smudge, not a nervous guess sketched in a trembling hand. It has shape. It has a coastline that curves and turns and bites inward. It has bays. It has what look, for all the world, like the mouths of rivers, little inlets where water would run down off the land and out into the sea. And I want you to sit with that detail for a moment, in the dark, because it is the detail that starts all the trouble. River mouths, because rivers need water that flows. And water that flows means water that is not frozen. It means rain and melt and streams running down to the coast. It means a land that is warm enough to be alive. It means, if you take the map at its word, a green and liquid continent sitting exactly where today there is nothing but 2 miles of ancient ice. You can already feel where this is going, because you met this argument in the last map. You remember the man's name, Charles Hapgood, the American professor, the one who looked at Piri Reis and saw the coast of Antarctica traced by some forgotten hand. Well, Hapgood looked at this one too, and if Piri Reis gave him a fragment, a bent and broken edge he had to squint at, Oronteus Fine gave him something that looked like a gift. A whole southern continent centred on the pole, with coastlines and bays and those telltale rivers. Hapgood said it plainly: Terra Australis on Fine's map matches an ice-free Antarctica so closely, so convincingly, that it could only have come down from an ancient survey. Someone, he argued, had mapped that southern land while it still had rivers, and Oronteus Fine, 4,000 years later, was merely copying a copy of their work, never knowing what he held. And I'll be honest with you, of the two, this is the more seductive claim. Piri Reis you had to argue for. This one almost argues for itself. There it sits, a shapely continent in exactly the right place, on a map drawn by a serious man, a mathematician, someone who did not deal in fairy tales. If you let your eye rest on it in the lamplight, it is very, very easy to believe you are looking at a memory of a lost world. So let's do what we always do. Let's turn the map over gently and see how it was really made. Start with the name itself, Terra Australis. Fine did not invent it, and neither did he invent the idea of drawing land there, because that continent has a longer name, one that tells you almost everything you need to know. Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. And that word unknown is doing something extraordinary, because it is written across a continent that people were nonetheless perfectly happy to draw. They labelled it unknown, and they drew it anyway. It appeared on map after map after map, all through the 1500s. Different cartographers, different countries, different years, and again down at the bottom of the world, the same great southern land. Why? Why would map after map show a continent that not a single living soul had ever seen? The answer is not a lost survey. The answer is much stranger and much more human than that. They drew it because they believed it had to be there. Here is how the reasoning went. And it is old, older than Fine, older than the printing press. It reaches all the way back to the Greeks. Look at the world, you know, the thinkers said. Look at all the weight of it. Europe, Asia, Africa, and now these new lands to the west. All this heavy land piled up in the northern half of the globe. And they believed deep in their bones that the earth was a thing of balance. That a world so top-heavy with land in the north would simply tip. That there had to be a counterweight down at the bottom, a great mass of land in the south to hold the whole spinning globe in equilibrium. Symmetry, the universe, they were sure did not make lopsided things. So they gave the south its continent, not because anyone had sailed there and seen it, because the shape of their thinking demanded it. They drew a landmass out of a feeling about how the world ought to be balanced, and then, being mapmakers, being artists, they dressed it. They gave it coastlines to make it look real. They added bays and inlets and river mouths, the ordinary furniture of any coast, because that is what a coast looks like, and an empty outline looks like an admission of ignorance. Oronteus Fine's rivers were not the record of some warm ancient Antarctica. They were his imagination being polite, filling in the details a real coast would have on a coast that existed only in the mind. And what about Hapgood's near-perfect match? The fit so good it made your skin prickle. Here is where you have to watch the hands very carefully, because the match was not found. It was made to lay Fines Terra Australis over the real Antarctica and get them to agree. Hapgood could not simply set one on top of the other. He had to work at it. First he had to rotate the whole map, turn it, roughly 20 degrees, twisting Fines' continent around until its features swung into a friendlier position. Then he had to move the pole. On Fines' map the South Pole sits in one place. On the real Earth it sits somewhere else, and to reconcile them Hapgood had to slide the entire polar centre by something on the order of 1,600 kilometres. Let that number settle, 1,600 kilometres. That is not a small correction, not a nudge to account for a shaky quill. That is picking up the bottom of the world and carrying it a distance greater than the length of France, several times over, and setting it down where you need it to be. And then, having rotated it and shifted the pole, he still had to rescale it, stretch it, shrink it, adjust its size until the outlines could be coaxed into something like agreement. And even after all of that, after the twisting and the 1,600-kilometre march of the pole and the rescaling, even then the fit is not what it seems, because Oronteus Fines continent is too big, not a little too big, enormously too big. Measured against the real Antarctica, Fines Terra Australis is roughly 230% of its size. More than double a continent inflated far past the true one, sprawling out across latitudes where the real ice never reaches. You do not have to twist and drag and rescale a genuine map. A genuine map already fits. The very fact that it took so much handling to force the resemblance is the quiet proof that the resemblance was never really there. Give a person enough freedom to rotate and shift and stretch, and they can make almost any large blob agree with almost any other. That isn't a memory surfacing. That's the human eye doing what it does best and worst, finding the pattern it went looking for. So no, Oronteus Fine never saw Antarctica, and neither did anyone who taught him. There is no lost survey folded into his beautiful heart. But before you feel the wonder drain out of it, I want you to look at what is actually there, because it is, in its way, more remarkable than the myth. Think about what these mapmakers really did. Decades before any ship pushed far enough south to prove there was land down there at all, nearly 300 years before human eyes first confirmed the coast of Antarctica in the early 1800s, Oronteus Fine and the cartographers of his age had already drawn a continent onto the bottom of the world, and they got the basic fact right. There is a great southern land. It is there, more or less where they put it. They were correct. But they were correct for a reason that had nothing to do with knowledge and everything to do with longing. They reasoned it into existence. They looked at a lopsided world, and they could not bear the imbalance, and so they filled the silence at the bottom of the map with exactly the thing they needed to feel that the world made sense. That is the real marvel of the Oronteus Finaeus map. Not that a lost civilization whispered its secrets across 4,000 years, but that the human mind is so hungry for symmetry, so unwilling to leave a beautiful shape half-finished, that it will conjure a whole continent out of pure conviction, and, every so often, by the sheer stubborn logic of it, turn out to be right. They didn't remember Antarctica, they wanted it, and sometimes, if the wanting is thoughtful enough, a good guess can look, centuries later, exactly like a memory. So we have two frozen souths now. Piri Reis with his bent and borrowed coast, and Oronteus Fine with his heart-shaped continent dreamed into being by the law of balance. And you might think we have reached the edge of what a mapmaker could plausibly do, drawing the outline of a land no one had seen. But there is a third map, later than these, drawn in Paris in the 1700s. And this one does not stop at the coastline. This one is stranger than anything you have heard tonight, because it does not merely show a southern continent. It shows the shape of the land beneath the ice, the hidden thing under the frozen skin of the world, split down the middle, as though someone had melted the whole continent away to look at what lay underneath. let me show you how that map came to be. The man who drew it was named Philippe Boissche, and of all the map makers in this story, he is perhaps the gentlest one to sit beside, because he was not a sailor, and he was not an admiral, and he never once claimed to have seen a thing he had not seen. He was a geographer in Paris, a quiet man of desks and dividers, of copied coastlines and careful reasoning. He belonged to the French Academy of Sciences. He had married into cartography, into the family workshop of the great Guillaume de Lille, and he spent his life doing something that sounds almost dull when you say it out loud. He thought about the shape of the world, not by walking it, by reasoning about it, and in 1739 he published a map of the far south. You will often see it dated 1737, and that date has crept into a great many books, but the map itself belongs to 1739. He called it the Carte des Terres Australes, the map of the southern lands. And when you look at it, something happens that did not happen with the other two. Because the first two frozen souths gave you a coastline, an edge, the rim of a continent, drawn as though someone had stood on the deck of a ship and traced where the water stopped and the white began. Piri Reis gave you an edge. Oronteus fine gave you an edge, wrapped neatly around the pole. That is strange enough to draw the outer shore of a land no one had landed on. But Boissche does not give you an edge. Boissche gives you the inside. Look closely. At the bottom of his map sits the great southern land, and it is not one continent at all. It is two broad masses of land, and running between them, splitting them apart down the middle, a sea, a central sea, frozen or half-frozen, cutting the southern continent in two like a knife laid down the spine of it, as though someone had melted the whole white south away, all of it, every metre of ice, and looked down at the bare rock underneath, and found that it was not one thing but two, with cold water pooled in the gap between. And here is the part that has kept people awake for 60 years. Because in the 1950s and the 60s and on into our own time, scientists began to do to Antarctica what no eye could ever do. They flew across it, dragging instruments that could see through ice. Radar that sends a pulse down through thousands of feet of frozen white and listens for the echo of the rock at the bottom. And slowly, pass by pass, they built a picture of the land that lies beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. The bedrock. The true continent, hidden under an ice cap up to 4 kilometres thick. And that hidden land, the one under the ice, is not a single tidy continent. Strip the ice away, and much of West Antarctica drops below sea level. What is left, the real bones of the place, looks less like one land mass and more like a scatter, a main body and a set of islands, a continent broken into pieces by water it can no longer hold back. A land, in other words, that is arguably two, or more than two, divided, just as Boissche drew it, 200 years too early, with a central sea between the halves, exactly where he put one. You can feel, can't you, how tightly that fits. Not the outer coastline this time, the interior, the buried shape, the thing under the frozen skin of the world. This is the strangest of the three claims by a long way, and it is worth saying plainly what the claim is. Charles Hapgood, the same man from the first two maps, looked at Boische's central sea and said, "Here it is. Here is the proof somebody, long ago, mapped Antarctica, not as it looks from a ship, but as it looks with the ice removed. Somebody charted the bedrock, and a coastline you might explain away as a lucky curve of the pen. But how do you accidentally draw the hidden interior of a continent no human being would see the inside of until the age of radar? How do you guess the bones under 4 kilometres of ice? Sit with that for a moment in the dark, because it really is a beautiful problem, and then let me show you how Philippe Boissche actually did it. Because he told us, he wrote it down, and it is quieter and cleverer, and in its own way lovelier than any lost civilization. Boissche never claimed a secret. He never spoke of ancient charts, of drowned map makers, of knowledge handed down from before the ice. He did something an 18th century man of the Academy would do. He reasoned. Here is the chain of his thinking. Sailors coming back from the deep southern ocean brought stories, and more than stories, they brought sightings. Ice, enormous islands of ice floating in the cold water, some of them the size of towns drifting north out of the white nowhere at the bottom of the world. Icebergs. And Boache, at his desk in Paris, asked a simple question about them. Where does that much ice come from? He believed, as many did then. That ice of that kind, freshwater ice, the ice of glaciers and frozen rivers, had to be born on land, or in water enclosed by land. Not in the open sea. It had to calve to break away from some great frozen basin. And if these mountains of ice were drifting up from the far south in such numbers, then somewhere down there, hidden behind the fog and the pack ice that no ship of his century could push through, there must be a vast frozen sea, a cold interior basin, sheltered by land on its sides, quietly manufacturing icebergs and sending them north, and a frozen sea in the middle needs land around it to hold it. Land on this side, land on that side, two land masses, cradling a central sea of ice between them. Do you see it? He did not remember the bedrock. He deduced the central sea from the icebergs, and then he drew the two lands that a central sea would require. He reasoned his way from floating ice off the coast of nowhere to a divided continent. It is a chain of inference, link by link, and every link is made of ordinary 18th century observation. Icebergs are real. They drift north. Freshwater ice needs a source. A source needs a basin needs shores. Two shores make two lands. That is the whole trick. That is the whole prophecy. And Boache, to his eternal credit, did not pretend otherwise. This is the detail that closes the door so softly you barely hear it click. He labelled his own map with the truth. Written across those southern lands, in his own careful French, are two words. Conjecturie, conjectured, and soupçonné, suspected. He is telling you, in ink, on the map itself, that this is a guess, a reasoned guess. He is not saying, this is what the ancients knew. He is saying, this is what I suspect must be there, and I am showing you my reasoning. The map is not a memory. It is an argument drawn out where you can check his working. And there is one more thing, and it is the quiet fact that unravels the whole marvel, because it points in exactly the wrong direction for the claim. Remember what the first two maps were supposed to prove. An ice-free Antarctica. A green south, mapped by ancient sailors before the cold came, with open coastlines and flowing rivers. That was the dream. A warm continent seen and charted, then buried. But Boache's map is covered in ice. It shows glaciers. It shows a frozen sea. Its entire logic depends on the south being cold, on the ice being there, on the bergs carving and drifting north through freezing water. Boache is not mapping a lost warm world. He is assuming a frozen one. He built the whole thing out of the cold. So the map that is supposed to be the strongest proof of an ice-free ancient Antarctica is, in fact, a monument to the opposite idea. It only works if the south is exactly as frozen as it really is. And even that famous match, the two lands, the central sea, the eerie fit with the radar maps, is looser than it first feels. Because the bedrock under Antarctica is not sitting there at rest. It is being crushed. Right now, tonight, the weight of that ice sheet, trillions of tons of it, is pressing the land down into the earth, the way you press a cushion with your hand. Geologists call the answer to that pressure isostatic rebound. Take the weight away, melt the ice, and the land does not stay where the radar sees it. It rises, slowly over thousands of years. It floats back up, and in places it would rise on the order of 500 meters, half a kilometer of drowned rock lifting back into the light. And if it did, much of that neat central division, the very split that makes Bouache look like a prophet, would rise up out of the water and close. The two islands would begin to fuse back toward one. The tidy gap he drew depends on the ice being there to hold the land down. Lift the ice, and you lose the very shape that made the map miraculous. So the fit is real, and it is haunting, and it is also, when you turn it over, a little softer than it looked in the dark. A reasoned guess about ice and oceans, drawn by a careful man in Paris, that happened to land close to a truth radar, would not confirm for another 2 centuries. Not a memory of the bedrock, a deduction sharp enough to pass for one. And that is the real wonder of Philippe Bouache. Not that he knew, that he thought, that 18th century geography, done well with dividers and reports, and a mind willing to follow the icebergs back to their source, could reach so far and so accurately past the edge of the visible world that 300 years later we mistake his reasoning for prophecy. A good enough guess, we said with the last map, can look like a memory, and now we can say something even quieter. A good enough chain of reasoning can look like a secret. So there they are, gathered together at last, 3 roads to the same white place. An Ottoman admiral in Istanbul, stitching a coastline from 20 older charts. A French mathematician drawing a heart-shaped world and folding a longed-for continent neatly around the pole. And a Paris geographer following the icebergs home to a sea he never saw. 3 maps of the frozen south, and not one of them needed a lost civilization. Only sailors and dividers and the stubborn human habit of reasoning past the horizon. And that, you might think, is the strangest a map can get. A land mapped before it was seen. But there is another way for a map to be impossible, and it is stranger still and darker, and in a way more human than any of these, because the 3 maps we have just held to the light were honest. Wrong in places, hopeful, overreaching, but honest. Every one of their makers was trying to tell the truth as best they could reason it. The next map was not. The next map is a lie. A deliberate, beautiful, carefully drawn lie. A map of islands that were never there, dreamed up to steal a piece of glory that belonged to someone else. And the astonishing thing, the thing that should not be possible, is that the lie worked. For 100 years it worked. It fooled the finest cartographers in Europe, and it sent real ships, with real sailors, out across a cold ocean, searching for a shore that had never existed anywhere but in one clever man's imagination. Let me show you how a forgery steered the world. Picture Venice in the year 1558. The city is at its height, all bells and canals and merchant fortunes, and a man named Niccolo Zeno, the younger, sits down to publish a book. He is a minor nobleman, a member of a great old Venetian family, and he says he has found something extraordinary in his family's attic. Old letters, fragments of a private family narrative, water-stained and falling apart, written a century and a half earlier by 2 of his own ancestors, also named Niccolo, and a brother, Antonio. According to the book, these 2 Zeno brothers had sailed out into the North Atlantic in the 1390s, not along the safe, known routes down to the Mediterranean or east to Byzantium, but out into the cold water above Scotland, above Iceland, into a part of the world no Venetian of that century was supposed to know at all. And to go with the letters, Niccolo the Younger published a map, a beautiful one, carefully engraved, confident, dense with names. It shows Iceland, drawn recognizably. It shows Greenland, drawn recognizably, labelled Engronland, and scattered around them, filling the gaps in the Northern Ocean. It shows 4 more islands that his ancestors had supposedly found and charted 160 years before. Frisland, a large island sitting just south of Iceland, drawn with careful bays and a scatter of town names, as if someone had walked its coast with a notebook. Estotiland, further west, toward what would one day be called Newfoundland. Icaria, to the south of that. Androgeo vaguer still, a smear of coastline hinting at something larger beyond it, something almost continental. Picture yourself leaning over that engraving by candlelight, the way a 16th century scholar might have. Nothing about it looks invented. The coastlines have the small, irregular imperfections of a place someone actually walked, not the tidy guesswork of a man drawing from rumour. There are dozens of town names on Frisland alone, tucked into bays that look lived in. And the accompanying book does not just show you a map. It tells you a story to go with it. It tells of a fisherman blown far off course in a storm, who washed up on the shore of Estotiland and lived there for years among its people, before making his way home again with tales of Drogeo further south, and of the strange customs of the men who lived there. A small, human, forgettable little anecdote, tucked inside a grand claim, exactly the kind of detail that makes an invented place start to feel real. Now sit with what that map was actually claiming, because it is a big claim, dressed up very quietly. If the Zeno brothers really sailed those waters in the 1390s, then a family of Venetian merchants had explored the North Atlantic a full century before Columbus ever left Spain. Venice, not Genoa. The Xenos, not the Zeno family's more famous rival, that other Genoese sailor everyone was busy praising. Here, on this one engraved sheet, was proof that the glory of the New World, or at least the glory of finding the door to it, belonged to Venice all along. And here is the part that should stop you. The map worked. Not for a decade. Not for a generation. For roughly 100 years, from the 1560s into the 1660s, Frisland sat on serious maps, drawn by serious men, sitting in the libraries of serious institutions. Mercator used it. Ortelius used it. It appears on globes. It appears in atlases printed in Antwerp and London and Amsterdam by cartographers who had every reason to be careful, who cross-checked their sources the way a scholar checks a citation, and who looked at the Zeno map and saw no reason to doubt it. Why would they? It read like a document. It had the texture of something recovered, not invented. It had dates and family names and the unglamorous, faded, water-damaged feel of a real archive. And because respectable maps carried it, real ships went looking for it. English and Dutch expeditions searching for a northern route to Asia sailed with Frisland, marked on their charts, expecting to sight its coast somewhere in the empty water south of Iceland. Martin Frobisher, hunting for a passage to the Orient in the 1570s, sailed in waters where Frisland was supposed to sit. Men stood at the rail in the cold and the fog, looking for a shore that had never existed anywhere except in one Venetian gentleman's imagination. It even reached into politics. English scholars arguing for their crown's claim to the New World, trying to show that an Englishman, or at least a European friendly to England, had reason to be there before the Spanish, leaned on the Zeno account as part of their case. A forged family memoir drawn up to flatter a Venetian name ended up quietly bolstering an empire's paperwork on the other side of the continent it never touched. Think about what that means for a moment. An island invented at a writing desk sent trained navigators, with real crews and real provisions, out to search an empty sea and helped kings argue about land they had never seen. That is not a curiosity in the margins of history. That is a lie with enough weight in it to alter the routes of real ships and the claims of real crowns for 100 years. So let it sit there, the way we've let the others sit. How does a fabricated island survive a century of scrutiny by the finest cartographers Europe has? What kind of forgery is good enough to fool Gerardus Mercator? Let me show you, because unlike the 3 maps before this one, the Zeno map does not survive its own homework. Piri Reis stitched together 20 real charts and told you so in the margins. Oronteus Fine reasoned his way to a continent that logic said ought to exist. Buesch followed the icebergs home and even labelled his own guesses as guesses conjectured, suspected, right there in his own hand. Every one of those men was doing his honest best with an incomplete world, Niccolo Zeno the Younger was not. The scholarly picture, built up carefully over more than a century of research into Venetian archives, is about as clear as these things get. There was no lost voyage. There was no rediscovered family narrative, at least not one describing anything like this. What there almost certainly was a clever compiler sitting in Venice in the 1550s with a stack of existing, already published maps of the North Atlantic in front of him, and a family name he wanted to make more famous. He took real geography, Iceland, Greenland, the northern coasts other cartographers had already drawn, and he studied it with invented islands, dressed the whole thing up as ancestral memory, and released it into a world hungry for exactly this kind of story, a hidden Venetian first, a quiet correction to history, arriving just when Venice's trading power was starting to slip, and a little borrowed glory would have gone down very easily indeed. And there is one piece of evidence that closes this case almost embarrassingly well, because it does not come from cartography at all. It comes from the plainest kind of paperwork there is, Venetian civil records. The real Niccolo Zeno, the supposed Arctic voyager of the 1390s, appears in the archives of his own city during exactly the years he was meant to be at sea. In 1394 he stood trial in Venice. In 1400 he sat down in Venice and wrote his own last will and testament. Not a letter sent home from some frozen northern harbour. A will filed with a notary in the city he was supposedly sailing away from. A man does not write his will in one city while charting the coast of another continent. He was home. He was, by every surviving piece of paper we have, exactly where a Venetian merchant of his standing ought to have been, tending to lawsuits and property, not standing on the deck of a ship above the Arctic Circle. Historians have not been gentle about this one. The Dictionary of Canadian Biography, in its entry on the affair, calls the Zeno narrative one of the most preposterous fabrications in the entire history of exploration. Preposterous. That is a strong word for careful academic prose, and it is used because the gap between the claim and the paper trail is that stark. This was not a mistake. It was not a sailor misjudging a coastline in the fog, or a scholar over-trusting an old rumour. It was constructed, name by name, island by island, to hand one family and one fading maritime republic, a piece of glory that history had already given to someone else. I find something almost tender in that, in the dark, even though it is a lie. Because think about what was actually being defended here. Not gold, not territory anyone could touch, just a story. Just the ache of watching another city's sailor get remembered forever while your own family fades into the ordinary business of contracts and courtrooms. By the 1550s, Venice's great age was already slipping. Its trade routes to the east were being quietly strangled by Portuguese ships sailing around Africa instead. And the whole Atlantic world, the whole future, seemed to belong to Spain and Genoa, and names that were not Venetian at all. A century-old claim to the New World, even a false one, must have felt. To a proud old family in a fading city, like something worth the risk of forging. Pride is a strange thing to build a map out of, and yet here is the evidence that someone did exactly that, and did it well enough and quietly enough, that it steered explorers for 100 years before anyone thought to check a Venetian notary's records. It makes you wonder, doesn't it, how much of what we think we know about the past has been quietly embroidered somewhere along the way. Not always with bad intentions. Sometimes just a family or a city or a single proud man wanting the story to come out a little more flattering than the plain record allows. We think about that a great deal, actually, in the small hours when a book like this one takes shape. We've written one ourselves about the secrets buried deeper still in prehistory, long before anyone was drawing maps at all, and if that kind of quiet unearthing appeals to you the way it does to us, you can find it on our website, sleepytimehistory.com. There's a discount running this week. Nothing urgent, just there if you'd like it. And now, back to the maps, because we have more coastlines to walk in the dark. So that is the fourth impossible map, and it is the strangest kind of impossible yet. Not a coastline drawn before anyone could see it, not a continent reasoned into being, a deliberate fiction engraved with such craft and such patience that it passed for memory for 100 years and sent real men out into real cold water chasing a shore that only ever existed in ink. What it reveals is simple and a little sobering and worth carrying with you the next time something looks too neatly documented to question. A map is not only a record of the world. Sometimes it is a weapon, quietly aimed at glory, dressed in the borrowed clothes of an old family archive. And a lie drawn well enough can steer the course of real ships and real arguments, for generations right up until someone finally thinks to check the will of a man who was supposed to be at sea. But not every map that seems to know too much is lying, and not every map that seems to know too much is reasoning its way there, either. There is one more coastline waiting for you tonight, drawn on the other side of the world entirely, far from Venice, far from the ice of the south. A map made by scholars who never boarded a ship bound that way, in a kingdom that had no navy chasing that horizon at all, and yet somewhere on their sheet of silk sits a shape, a long southward-pointing tip of land that should not have been theirs to know. Let me take you there next. Picture a palace workshop in Hanseong, the city we now call Seoul, in the year 1402. The Joseon dynasty is young, barely a decade old, still finding its footing, and inside this workshop 2 scholars are bent over a sheet of silk far larger than anything you would keep in a drawer. One is named Kwon Kun, the other is Yi Ho. They are not sailors. Neither man has ever stood on the deck of a ship bound anywhere farther than the Korean coast, and yet the map growing under their brushes claims to show the entire world. Its full name is a mouthful even in translation. The Onilgangni Yokdea Gukdo Ji-du, which comes out, roughly, as the map of integrated lands and regions of historical countries and capitals. Everyone just calls it the Kangnido now, and if you unrolled it in front of you tonight, the first thing you would notice is exactly what you would expect from a court map commissioned by a new dynasty eager to announce itself. Korea sits large and confident on the sheet, far larger than it has any geographic right to be. China sits beside it, even larger still, dominating the centre of the whole composition the way the Chinese maps it was copied from always insisted it should. This is a map that knows exactly whose court it was painted for. Pride, drawn in ink, the same as it ever was. But follow the silk outward, past China, past the edge of what any Korean scholar could plausibly have measured with his own 2 feet, and something strange starts to happen. There is India, compressed and simplified, but recognizably there. There is the Arabian Peninsula, and then, further still, past all of it, there is a landmass that should not be on this sheet at all. A continent drawn with a long, tapering shape, narrowing as it runs south, curling to a point, and then unmistakably turning. Africa. Not a vague blob standing in for the unknown lands to the west. The way so many medieval maps handled the parts of the world nobody had reached. A shaped Africa with a recognizable southward pointing tip, and scattered along its coasts and inland reaches, someone has patiently written out roughly 35 place names. 35, not one polite label reading unknown continent. 35 actual names sitting on a continent that, as far as anyone in Joseon Korea could have told you, no Korean had ever sailed anywhere near. Here is where you should feel the strangeness settle in, the way you're meant to by now. Bartolomeu Dias, the Portuguese navigator, did not round the southern tip of Africa, the point we call the Cape of Good Hope, until 1488. Write that down and hold it next to the date on this silk. 1402. That is 86 years. 86 years before any European ship confirmed, by actually sailing around it, that Africa even had a southern tip you could round at all. And here it is anyway, drawn calmly, correctly, by two men in a palace on the far side of Asia, in a kingdom with no navy chasing that horizon, no fleet of Joseon ships nosing down the coast of a continent. Nobody in Korea had any commercial reason to visit. How does a court map in Seoul get the shape of Africa right, 86 years early, when the men holding the brushes never left home? Before we go further, it's worth knowing that no original 1402 Kangnido survives today. What we actually study are two later copies, careful hand-painted versions made in the following centuries, and both of them, oddly enough, now live not in Korea, but in Japan. One is kept at Ryukoku University in Kyoto. The other belongs to a small Buddhist temple, Honkoji, and surfaced publicly only in the 20th century. Two Korean court maps quietly preserved for hundreds of years inside Japanese collections, waiting for scholars to notice what was sitting in the storerooms. That alone should tell you something about how maps travel and how easily the knowledge inside them can slip across a border and simply keep existing unnoticed long after the kingdom that made them has moved on to other concerns. Sit with that question for a moment, the way we've sat with the others tonight, because it is a real question, and it deserves a real answer. And for once, this is not going to be a story about a forgery or a clever guess, or a symmetry drawn out of longing. This is the one map tonight that is simply quietly, completely true. There is no debunking to do here, no trial records to dig up, no notary's will to check, no rotation and rescaling to force a bad fit into a good one. The Kangnido knew what it knew. The only question worth asking is how, and the answer, once you follow it, is more beautiful than any lost civilization would have been. Kwon Kun tells you himself, actually, right there in his own preface to the map, if you know where to look. He is honest about his sources in a way that should feel familiar by now. He explains that the eastern portion, the part built around Korea and Japan, was newly surveyed and added by Korean hands. But the sprawling western portion, the part that reaches all the way out through India and Arabia and curls down into Africa, he says plainly, was based on earlier Chinese maps. Two of them in particular credited to Chinese cartographers, one associated with a scholar named Li Zemin, whose own world map, made a few decades earlier under the Yuan dynasty, already carried that same recognizable African shape. Kwon Kun and Yi Ho were not surveying the coast of Mozambique. They were compiling. They took the best available Chinese scholarship of their day, merged it with a separate Chinese map of Korea and Japan, added their own eastern detail, and stitched the whole enormous picture together onto one sheet of silk. That is not a lesser kind of achievement, incidentally. Compiling honestly, crediting your sources, and getting the shape of a continent right that you have never seen is its own kind of quiet mastery. But it does mean the mystery isn't really about Korea at all. It's about how a Chinese map, decades earlier, already knew. And that is where the real thread starts to run, back through Yuan dynasty China, and back further still into a world that traded knowledge far more freely than we tend to imagine when we picture the medieval centuries. Because Chinese cartographers in the 13th and 14th centuries were not the ones who had sailed down Africa's eastern coast and around its cape either. The people who had actually done that, who had actually seen those shorelines with their own eyes and measured them well enough to draw them, were Arab and Persian sailors and geographers, moving along the Indian Ocean trade routes that had linked East Africa to the Arabian Peninsula and on to India for centuries before any of these maps were drawn. Islamic geography by the time of the Yuan dynasty already held a working picture of Africa's eastern coast and its southern reach, carried in the accumulated logs and sailing directions and scholarly treatises of sailors who made that run as ordinary business, the way a merchant today might fly a familiar route for the 100th time. So how does knowledge like that travel from an Arab dhow, captain's sailing notes, or a Persian geographer's careful treatise, all the way to a silk workshop in Seoul, without a single Korean ship ever making the journey itself? The answer is the same great sprawling network that for one violent, remarkable century had connected almost the entire breadth of Asia into something closer to a single conversation than a scattering of separate, silent kingdoms, the Mongol Empire. Under Yuan rule, the roads and relay stations that the Mongols built to move armies and administrators also moved scholars and maps and the accumulated geographic knowledge of every culture the empire had swallowed or traded with, from the Islamic world in the west all the way to the Korean peninsula in the east. This was the same century that let a Venetian merchant's son named Marco Polo walk overland all the way to a Mongol court in China and back again, and write a book about it that Europe could barely believe. If a Venetian could make that crossing on ordinary trade roads, you can start to imagine how easily a Persian geographic treatise, or a well-drawn Arab sailing chart, could ride the same relay stations in the other direction, carried by merchants and envoys who thought nothing of it, simply doing their jobs. Chinese court cartographers, sitting inside that empire, had access to Persian and Arab geographic works in a way that would have been unthinkable a few centuries earlier, when the old Silk Road still had to fight for every mile against distance and distrust. They folded that borrowed knowledge into their own maps, quietly, the way any careful scholar folds a good source into a new one. And when the Yuan dynasty fell and Korea's new Joseon court went looking for the best available picture of the world to hang its own authority on, it was that same layered, borrowed, quietly cosmopolitan Chinese cartography that came east across the border and landed decades later in Kwon Kun's careful hands. Think about what that actually means for a moment in the dark. On one sheet of silk, painted by two men who never left the Korean peninsula, sits the accumulated sight of Arab sailors who had actually rounded that African coastline, filtered through Persian scholarship, absorbed by Chinese cartographers living under Mongol rule, and carried the rest of the way home by scholars serving a brand new Korean court. Nobody on that chain of transmission needed to be lying, or guessing, or reasoning their way to a shape they couldn't see. They only needed to be listening to each other. Arab knowledge, Chinese hands, Korean silk. Three cultures that never needed to share a single sailor, and yet together they knew. And maybe this is really the thing every map tonight has been circling, without quite saying it outright. Not a lost, forgotten super-civilization with secrets we've misplaced. Just knowledge, doing what knowledge has always done when the roads are open and the will to write things down survives the journey. Travelling, sailor to scholar, scholar to court, court to silk, quietly, patiently, until a shape that took someone else's lifetime of sailing to learn ends up drawn correctly on the other side of a continent, by hands that never got wet. There is something almost tender in picturing it that way, isn't there? A Korean court scholar in 1402, dipping his brush, drawing a coastline he will never see, trusting a chain of strangers, most of them long dead by then, stretching back through a Mongol road and a Chinese archive, and further still into the log of some Arab captain who once actually watched that African cape come up over the bow of his ship. None of them ever met each other. None of them ever knew their small piece of the coastline would end up on a Korean king's wall. And yet here it is, still legible 600 years later, sitting quietly in a Japanese collection, waiting for anyone patient enough to trace the 35 names on its western edge back to the people who actually earned them. The Kangnido doesn't ask you to believe in anything impossible at all. It only asks you to believe that the medieval world was talking to itself, quietly, across languages and empires and oceans, far more than the silence between old kingdoms usually lets on. Every other map tonight has needed an explanation to close a gap between what it showed and what its maker could have known. This one closes that gap simply by widening the picture, by reminding you that what its maker could have known was never limited to what its maker had personally seen. But not every map tonight is content to inherit its knowledge second-hand. There is one more coastline waiting for you, drawn a little over a century after this one, on the other side of the world again, this time by a map-maker who wasn't compiling anyone else's sightings at all. A man who took a strange new name, gave it to strange new lands, and then, with nothing but a hunch and a blank space where an ocean ought to be, drew water that no European eye had ever confirmed was there. Let me show you what he saw before anyone else did. Picture a print shop in a small town called Saint-Dié, tucked into the mountains of Lorraine in the year 1507. There is no coastline for hundreds of miles in any direction. The man running this shop, a German cartographer named Martin Waldseemüller, has never crossed an ocean, never boarded a ship bound anywhere farther than the nearest river town. And yet spread across his workbench drying in 12 separate woodblock panels that will eventually be pasted together into a single sheet, roughly 4 feet tall and 8 feet wide, is a map of the entire world. He calls it the Universalis Cosmographia. Hang all 12 panels on a wall, the way a wealthy patron of the time might have, and you would be standing in front of one of the largest, most ambitious printed pictures the world had ever produced. And somewhere on that enormous sheet, in small, unassuming letters, sits a word that had never been written on any map, in any language, in all of human history, until this exact moment. America. Say that out loud to yourself, quietly, and let it sit there. It is such a familiar word now that it barely feels like an event at all, the way a word you have known your entire life stops feeling like it was ever new. But it had to start somewhere. It had to be written for the first time by someone, on some specific sheet of paper, in some specific year. And that year was 1507, and that someone was Martin Waldseemüller, and the place he wrote it was not North America at all, where you might expect a name that big to land. He wrote it across the southern continent, the landmass we now call South America, in honour of an Italian navigator named Amerigo Vespucci, not Columbus. Columbus, who had crossed the ocean first, who had planted flags and claimed islands, and spent his final years still insisting he had reached the outer edges of Asia, does not get his name on this map at all. Vespucci does, because it was Vespucci's letters, describing voyages down the coast of what is now Brazil, that convinced Waldseemüller of something Columbus himself never fully accepted. This was not Asia. This was something the Old World had no name for. So Waldseemüller gave it a feminized Latin version of Amerigo, and set it down on paper, and the name simply never came off. 2 entire continents, still known by a printer's best guess at how to honour a letter writer, 500 years later. That alone would be strange enough to sit with tonight. But look a little further west on that same sheet of silk-thin paper, and there is a second thing on this map that should not be there at all. Past the new southern landmass, past the coastline Vespucci had actually sailed, Waldseemüller has drawn open water. A broad, unbroken ocean, stretching out to the edge of the panel, separating these new lands entirely from Asia. Not a narrow strait, not a vague, uncertain smudge where the ink trails off into unknown. An ocean, confidently inked, wide enough to mean something. Here is why that should stop you. No European had confirmed that ocean existed. Not yet. Vasco Núñez de Balboa, the Spanish explorer usually credited as the first European to lay eyes on what we now call the Pacific, did not climb that ridge in Panama and see it glittering below him until 1513. Write that down next to the date on Waldseemüller's map, 1507. 6 years. 6 years before any documented European eye had seen so much as a glimmer of that water. A German map-maker who never left the mountains of Lorraine had already drawn it in, already decided the new lands Vespucci described were not a ragged eastern edge of Asia at all, but a whole separate continent, with a whole separate ocean lying quietly beyond it, waiting for someone else to catch up. How does a man with no ship, no crew, and no coastline of his own managed to separate two continents that, on every other map of his era, were still cheerfully drawn as one and the same. The honest answer, the one that historians who have studied Waldseemüller's working papers keep coming back to, is not that he knew something. It is that he reasoned something, and once you see how it becomes, if anything, more remarkable than a secret would have been. Waldseemüller had Vespucci's letters in front of him, describing coastline after coastline that simply refused to match anything in Ptolemy's ancient geography, the Greek framework that had shaped every European mapmaker's picture of the world for well over 1,000 years. Ptolemy's Asia had a shape, a set of expectations, an edge you were supposed to reach eventually, if you just kept sailing west long enough, exactly the bet Columbus had made and never quite let go of. But Vespucci's coastline kept going, and going, south, for thousands of miles, past every point where Ptolemy's Asia should have curved back toward something familiar. Waldseemüller sat with that mismatch and made a decision that took real intellectual nerve for its time. If this land did not fit onto the old map of Asia, then it probably was not Asia. It was something new, a novus mundus, a new world, the very phrase Vespucci himself had used, and that Waldseemüller printed boldly right there on the page. And if it was new land, genuinely separate from Asia, then logic demanded something else had to follow. Somewhere beyond it there had to be water. You cannot have a new continent quietly wedged into the old picture of the globe without opening up an ocean on its far side to make room for it. The historian Peter Whitfield, who has spent a career studying maps exactly like this one, calls what Waldseemüller did here a leap of intuition, not a discovery, a leap. He drew an ocean because his reasoning told him one had to exist, long before any sailor walked back into a European port and confirmed it with his own eyes. Think about what that leap actually required, in an age before satellites, before triangulated coastlines, before anyone had a reliable way to measure longitude at sea at all. Waldseemüller was not adding a small correction to an existing map. He was rewriting the shape of the entire known world based on the testimony of one navigator's letters, choosing to trust a mismatch in the evidence over more than 1,000 years of inherited Greek authority. Ptolemy was not some minor scholar you could quietly disagree with over supper. His geography was the closest thing Renaissance Europe had to settled scientific fact, taught, copied, and trusted for generation after generation. To look at that inheritance and decide, quietly, in a workshop in the mountains, that it was simply wrong about this one enormous stretch of the earth, and then to draw the consequences of that wrongness all the way out to an ocean nobody had seen, was not the work of a man copying a chart. It was the work of a man willing to follow an idea further than his evidence technically allowed, and trusting his own reasoning to carry him the rest of the way. And here is the quiet, almost eerie part of the story. He was right. 6 years later, Balboa stood on that ridge in Panama and saw water where Waldseemüller had already, sight unseen, put water. A few years after that, Ferdinand Magellan's expedition sailed all the way across it, giving that ocean the name it still carries today, the Pacific. Waldseemüller never claimed to know this. He never said he had inside information, never pointed to some hidden source, never dressed his reasoning up as certainty. He made an inference from a mismatch in the evidence in front of him, and reality happened to agree with him afterward. That is not prophecy. That is what a sharp, careful mind looks like, when it is willing to trust its own logic further than the evidence strictly allows, and then simply gets lucky enough or good enough to land on the truth before anyone can prove it. But the story of this map does not end with what is printed on it. It continues with what almost happened to the paper itself, and this part, I think, might be the most quietly astonishing detail of the whole night. Waldseemüller's workshop printed roughly 1,000 copies of this map. 1,000, meant to be sold, hung, studied, referenced by other map makers, copying his new coastlines and his new name into their own work, the way any successful map of the era would have been used and reused until it simply wore out or went out of fashion. And for nearly 400 years, every single one of those 1,000 copies disappeared. Not most of them, not nearly all of them, everyone. Scholars knew the map had existed, because later map makers had clearly copied details from it, quoting a document nobody could actually locate anymore. Imagine that for a moment, in the dark, the way you might imagine a house you grew up in that simply is not there anymore when you go looking for it. The single sheet of paper that had given 2 continents their name, gone. Not destroyed dramatically, not burned or lost at sea in some cinematic disaster, just quietly misplaced over and over, generation after generation, the way ordinary paper so often is, until nobody alive had ever actually seen one. Then, in 1901, a Jesuit scholar named Joseph Fischer was working his way through the library of an old German castle, Schloss Wulfegg, tucked away in the countryside, cataloguing whatever old volumes the family living there happened to still own, and bound into a large atlas of maps sitting on a shelf in that castle library, the way it apparently had been sitting for who knows how many decades, was a copy. Not even, strictly, one of the original 1,000 from 1507. What Fisher found was a later printer's proof, made from the same woodblock sometime after 1516, close enough to the original to carry every detail that mattered, but technically its own quiet echo of the first printing. And it was the only one, the only copy of this map in any printing known to exist anywhere on Earth. One sheet of paper sitting in a castle library, holding the first written appearance of the word America, and an ocean guessed at 6 years before anyone saw it, and it had simply never been found by anyone who understood what they were looking at for nearly 4 centuries. The Wulfegg family kept it for another 100 years after Fisher identified it, and then, in 2001, the United States Library of Congress agreed to buy it. $10 million for one sheet of paper, larger than the sale price of almost anything else ever paid for a single map before or since. The sale finally closed in 2003, and the map crossed the Atlantic it had once so confidently guessed at, folded carefully into a case built to protect it from the light and the air and the ordinary wear that had already claimed every other copy that ever left a printing press. It has hung on public display in Washington since 2007. Kept behind glass, temperature, and humidity, watched the way you might watch something that stopped a heartbeat once and could do it again. Still the only copy anyone has ever found. People who work there sometimes call it, quite plainly, America's birth certificate. It is not a metaphor stretched too far. It is closer to the literal truth. A name written once on a single surviving sheet. Sit with the full shape of that for a moment before we move on. A landlocked printer in the mountains of France, working from someone else's letters, made one careful leap of reasoning about a coastline he would never see, and in doing so gave 2 entire continents the name they still answer to today. Then that same leap of reasoning very nearly vanished from the world completely, saved from 400 years of silence by a single overlooked page in a castle library, one copy standing between everything you know about that name and nothing at all. A name and a guessed ocean, on one sheet of paper, and the sheet almost didn't make it. Not every map from this era earned its strangeness through honest reasoning, though. The next one waiting for you tonight carries its own coastline drawn with real confidence, somewhere between real land and wishful invention, and for more than 2 centuries now, people have argued bitterly over what it is actually showing. Some look at its long curling shore tucked in below the islands of the East Indies, and see nothing more than an old mapmaker's mistake, repeated and dressed up until it looked like a real place. Others look at that same coastline and see something far bolder. A whole continent, they say, charted and quietly kept secret more than 2 centuries before anyone official ever admitted it was there. The maps that carry this argument were not made in Spain or Portugal, or even in Waldseemüller's quiet mountain workshop. They were made in a French port called Dieppe, on the English Channel, sometime between the 1540s and the 1560s, by a loose circle of cartographers historians now simply call the Dieppe School. You have probably never heard their names spoken aloud, so let them settle for a moment. Pierre Desailliers, a priest and mapmaker working under royal patronage. Jean Rotz, who carried his own version across the water to present to King Henry VIII of England. Guillaume Le Testu, who would later sail with French corsairs and die fighting the Spanish in Panama. And an unnamed hand or hands behind something called the Vallard Atlas, quietly kept today in a library in California of all places, as far from that channel port as it is possible to imagine. These were not rough working charts meant to survive a storm at sea. They were commissioned objects, painted in gold leaf and rich colour, crowded with tiny ships under full sail and compass roses and animals that look faintly bewildered to find themselves on a map at all, made for kings and wealthy patrons who wanted the whole known world laid out across a table like a piece of art. And on several of these gorgeous, expensive, carefully lettered sheets, tucked in below the scattered islands of the East Indies, there sits a long, curling coastline that should not, by any account anyone has ever agreed on, be there at all. The label beside it reads Jave la Grande, Great Java. Say that quietly to yourself and picture the shape of it on the page. Below the real island of Java, which sailors of the 16th century genuinely knew and traded with, the Dieppe maps draw something enormous. A long eastern shore, a shorter western one, bays that curl inward the way a real coastline curls when a river has cut into it, little painted details along the coast, tiny figures, tiny settlements, drawn with the same careful hand that painted the ships. It looks to a modern eye squinting at it in a museum case or a high-resolution scan, uncannily like the eastern edge of a continent nobody in Europe was supposed to know existed yet. Here is why that should sit uneasily with you. The coastline of eastern Australia was not supposedly seen by any European until 1606, when a Dutch captain named Willem Janszoon touched the northern coast of Cape York in a ship called the Doofken, and the entire eastern coastline, the long curling shore you can trace with your finger down toward what is now Sydney and beyond, was not properly charted by anyone official until Captain James Cook sailed HMS Endeavour up that same coast in 1770, claiming it for the British Crown and giving the world its first reliable outline of the place. 1770. Now look back at the Dieppe maps again. 1540s, 1550s, more than 200 years before Cook, and there on parchment painted for a French king sits a coastline that some people have spent nearly 2.5 centuries insisting is not a mistake at all, but Australia. Charted quietly, kept secret, and then, for reasons nobody agrees on, allowed to be forgotten by everyone except a handful of map makers in one French port town. This idea has a name. Historians and enthusiasts alike call it the theory of the Portuguese discovery of Australia, and it did not start as some fringe internet rumour. It has real roots, and real serious people have taken it seriously. The first person on record to look at Jave la Grande and suggest something more than coincidence was a British hydrographer named Alexander Dalrymple, all the way back in 1786, only 16 years after Cook's voyage, when the memory of that coastline was still fresh enough for the resemblance to feel startling rather than merely curious. But the theory's most powerful champion came nearly 2 centuries later in 1977, when an Australian historian named Kenneth McIntyre published a book called The Secret Discovery of Australia. McIntyre did not simply gesture at the shape of the coastline and call it a day. He went bay by bay, cape by cape, laying the painted Dieppe coastline over a modern chart of Queensland and New South Wales, and arguing that specific curves, specific inlets, specific named features on Jave la Grande corresponded, feature for feature, with real places on the real Australian coast. He proposed that unnamed Portuguese sailors, working in secret for the Portuguese crown, had reached the eastern coast of Australia sometime in the 1520s, more than 200 years before Cook, and that their charts, forbidden from circulation under Portugal's famously strict policy of guarding its trade routes, had somehow leaked out, copied and recopied, until fragments of that secret survey ended up painted in gold leaf on tables in Dieppe. Sit with that for a moment, because I want you to feel the pull of it honestly, the way you would feel it if someone laid MacIntyre's book open in front of you and pointed at the matching capes with a steady finger. It is not a foolish idea. It touches something that matters to a lot of people. If it were true, it would mean Australia's real European story does not begin with Cook standing on that deck in 1770, planting a flag, but with quiet, forgotten Portuguese sailors slipping along that coast in secret 2.5 centuries earlier, their names lost, their voyage erased on purpose by a government that specialised in erasing exactly this kind of thing to protect its trading advantage. For a country whose national story often starts in the popular imagination, at that single moment on the Endeavour's deck, the idea of an older, secreted, more mysterious beginning has genuine emotional weight. People who believe it are not cranks chasing a curiosity. They are, in a real sense, reaching for a longer, stranger version of their own history, one hidden in plain sight on painted French parchment for 400 years. That is worth respecting even as we look carefully at what the evidence actually holds up. And here is where the story gently has to turn. Because for all the passion MacIntyre brought to it, and for all the very real coastline sitting there on those maps, no Portuguese chart of Jave la Grande has ever been found. Not one. Portugal kept meticulous, obsessive secrecy around its discoveries in this period, that much is true and well documented, guarding trade routes to the Indies as a matter of state policy. But secrecy of that kind leaves fingerprints. Ships' logs, court records, disputes over trading rights, the ordinary bureaucratic residue any nation leaves behind when it actually sends ships somewhere and profits from it. None of that residue exists for a Portuguese voyage to eastern Australia. No log, no captain's name, no original chart, secret or otherwise, has ever surfaced in any Portuguese or Spanish archive in 4 centuries of people looking. What survives is only the Dieppe copies themselves, made decades after the supposed voyage, by French cartographers working from sources nobody can fully trace. So where did the coastline actually come from? A New Zealand historian named Andrew Sharp took this question apart with real patience in the 20th century, and his answer is less a secret and more a kind of very ordinary cartographic accident. The sort of mistake that happens when a map gets copied by hand one too many times. Sharp argued that what the Dieppe school was actually drawing, underneath all that gold leaf and confident coastline, was the real island of Java, the one everyone already knew about, drawn not once but twice. Portuguese charts of Java existed in genuine circulation by this period, at varying scales and with the inevitable small errors that crept in with every hand-copied chart of the era. Sharp's case is that a French cartographer working with more than one of these Java charts at different scales misaligned and duplicated them, stretching what should have been one island into what reads on the page as 2 separate landmasses, the smaller real Java to the north and a vastly exaggerated southern coastline below it, dressed up and extended until it looked like something new entirely. Onto that stretched, doubled error. The map makers then layered in details borrowed from older sources, still circulating in their libraries, including, Sharp points out, the centuries-old travel accounts of Marco Polo, who had written of a fabulous southern land called Locarque, and the ever-present, purely theoretical terra australis that so many map-makers of this age simply assumed had to exist somewhere below the known world to balance the continents of the north. Notice, if you will, how familiar that particular move should feel to you by now tonight. Stretch a coastline, rotate it, adjust the scale until an old ordinary chart starts to resemble something it was never meant to be. We have watched that exact kind of straining and rescaling before this evening, applied to a very different frozen coastline far to the south, and it did not hold up any better there than it does here. A resemblance built on rotating and rescaling an imprecise old coastline is not the same thing as a resemblance built on an accurate survey, however much the two can look alike to an eye that wants very badly to see a match. And there is one more detail in this particular case that closes the door with unusual gentleness, because it comes from inside the Dieppe school itself, not from some outside skeptic centuries later picking the theory apart. Pierre de Celiers, the priest who made one of the most famous and most detailed of these maps, wrote his own annotation directly onto the coastline in question. He noted in his own hand that this land had never been discovered. Not a boast of secret knowledge, not a wink toward a hidden Portuguese survey his patrons were meant to understand. A plain, almost apologetic admission from the very cartographer holding the brush that what he was painting was known to be conjecture, dressed beautifully, but conjecture all the same. None of this makes Kenneth MacIntyre's matching capes and curling bays meaningless. Exactly. It only means that a resemblance, however carefully counted and cross-referenced, is not the same thing as a confirmed voyage, and that the human eye is remarkably good at finding a face in the clouds once it has decided to go looking for one. What Jave la Grande actually reveals, when you set the wishful version gently aside, is something almost more human than a secret voyage would have been. A copying error made honestly by a working cartographer stretching one imperfect chart to fill a gap in his knowledge of the world, elaborated with old travellers' tales and an ancient, unproven dream of a great southern land, painted so beautifully and so confidently that it fooled kings, fooled scholars for 2 centuries, and still, even tonight, tugs gently at people looking for a longer story than the one history officially gave them. The dream of that vast, unseen southern continent did not begin with the Dieppe school, and it did not end with them either. It kept leaking out, quietly, onto map after map of this age, a shape drawn again and again by people who were certain something enormous had to be waiting down there, long before anyone had the ships or the courage, or simply the reason to go and look. We have spent this whole night, so far, among parchment and printed paper, among map-makers with names and workshops and patrons. We can still trace through court records and library catalogues, 4 and 5 centuries back at the very oldest. But the next map waiting for you tonight belongs to a different order of time altogether. We are done, for now, with the great age of exploration, with its kings and its secret trade routes and its beautifully painted lies. What comes next was not drawn with ink on skin or paper at all. It was pressed into wet clay, baked hard by a hand that has been dust for nearly 3,000 years, in a world so old that Rome had not yet been founded, and the very idea of a printing press lay more than 2,000 years in the future. Let yourself drift there slowly. We're going back now, far past anything you have heard tonight, into the oldest maps human beings ever thought to make. Picture a piece of clay small enough to rest in both your hands. Not gold leaf, not painted parchment stretched across a table for a king to admire. Just clay, the colour of dried riverbank, pressed with a reed stylus by someone whose name we will never know, then baked hard in a kiln, or perhaps simply hardened by the heat of a fire that has long since gone cold. That object survived. It survived wars and empires rising and falling, and 3,000 years of sand moving slowly over the ground above it, until it was dug out of the earth at a place called Sippar, an ancient city on the Euphrates in what is now Iraq, and carried eventually into a quiet room in London, where it now sits behind glass in the British Museum, catalogued under a number that looks almost too plain for what it holds. BM 92687. Scholars call it the Imago Mundi, Latin for image of the world, though nobody who made it would have recognized that name. Most people simply call it the Babylonian Map of the world. It comes from the Neo-Babylonian period, likely the 8th or 7th century BCE, so let yourself sit with that. roughly 2,700 years ago. Rome had not been founded yet, not even in legend. The Parthenon in Athens did not exist. And already someone in Mesopotamia had taken a piece of wet clay and tried to press the entire known world onto it, all at once, small enough to hold. That is what makes this object, this cracked and unassuming tablet you could cover with one hand, the oldest surviving map that attempts to show the whole world. Not a coastline, not a trade route, not one river valley or one kingdom's borders. All of it, everything the people who made it believed existed, compressed into a circle scratched into wet earth. Now, before you picture something like the maps we have spent this whole night looking at, painted coastlines and compass roses and careful curving shores, let that image go. This is not that kind of map. It was never meant to get anyone anywhere. There is no scale here you could measure a journey by, no attempt to render the world the way your eye actually sees it from above. It is something closer to a diagram of belief than a document for travel. And once you understand that, the shapes on it start to make a different kind of sense. Look at the center of the circle, and you find two long parallel lines running down through the middle of everything. That is the Euphrates, the river the mapmaker's own life depended on, drawn not as it winds and curls in reality, but as two straight, deliberate strokes, because on this map, being accurate to the eye mattered far less than being accurate to what was important. Just north of the center of that river sits a rectangle. A single plain rectangle slightly larger than the marks around it. That rectangle is Babylon, not because Babylon happened to fall in the geographic middle of the ancient Near East. It doesn't, not really. It sits there because whoever pressed that shape into the clay believed in the way you believe the sun rises in the east. That Babylon was the center of everything there was, scattered around that rectangle are small circles, each one marking another city, another region, some of them places we can still identify today, some of them lost to us the way so much of this world is lost. And then, holding all of it, running around the entire outer edge of the known world, like a bowl holding water, is a single ring. The mapmaker labelled it, in cuneiform pressed into the clay, the Bitter River, Maratu, the great salt ocean believed to encircle every land anyone had ever set foot on, the boundary past which the known world simply stopped. Here is where it gets strange, though, in the quiet way that only the oldest things can be strange. Because past that ring of bitter water, the tablet does not simply end. Beyond the ocean, scattered around the outside of the circle like spokes, are a handful of triangular shapes, pointing outward into empty space. The Babylonians called these regions Nagu, distant, mysterious lands beyond the edge of the sea, beyond the edge of anything a person from Sippar or Babylon could ever hope to visit or verify. We don't fully know what the mapmaker believed lived out there. That, in itself, is the point. The map is honest about where its own knowledge runs out. It draws the unknown as a shape, and then it stops. For a long time, that was more or less where the story of this little tablet rested. A curiosity. The oldest known attempt at a world map, genuinely remarkable, quietly displayed, studied by a small circle of Assyriologists who could read the wedge-shaped script and argue gently among themselves about what a few of the more damaged labels might mean. And then, in 2024, something on the back of the tablet pulled it briefly into headlines all over the world. Here's the part that made people sit up. The front of the tablet is the map itself, the circle, the rectangle, the ring of bitter water, but the back of the tablet is covered in dense cuneiform text, and for a long time large sections of that text were simply too broken, too eroded to read with any confidence. Irving Finkel, a curator at the British Museum, who has spent much of his career coaxing meaning out of exactly this kind of damaged clay, went back to that reverse side, and, working with a colleague, managed to piece together new sense from it. What he found was a kind of guide. instructions of a sort for travelling out to those triangular Nagu beyond the bitter ocean. And tucked into that text was a word that made the whole thing leap out of the realm of pure geography. Parsiktu. A vessel, a very particular kind of vessel, one whose dimensions in the old flood stories of Mesopotamia belonged to a boat built by a man named Utnapishtim. If that name means nothing to you, sit with this instead. Long before there was a man named Noah in any book you might have grown up hearing about, there was Utnapishtim, a figure from far older Mesopotamian flood traditions, the Epic of Gilgamesh among them, a man told by the gods that the world was about to drown and told to build a great vessel to survive it. And according to the old texts, when the waters receded, that vessel came to rest in the mountains of a land called Urartu, which some people then and now have connected to a name you almost certainly do know, Ararat. So picture the headlines that followed. A map showing directions to Noah's Ark, they said, some of them all but breathless about it. A 3,000-year-old clay tablet in a London museum, quietly holding travel instructions to the resting place of the flood boat itself. Hiding in plain sight the whole time, on the one side nobody had bothered to fully translate. I want you to feel the pull of that for a moment honestly. The way this whole night has tried to let you feel each of these mysteries before gently setting them down, because there is something genuinely moving about it. A very old story about a flood that ends the world and a boat that saves what's left of it, showing up in the cuneiform on the back of an even older map. That connection is real. Finkel found it. Another respected scholar of Mesopotamian geography, Wayne Horowitz, whose own work on Babylonian cosmology has shaped how we understand this tablet for decades, has engaged with exactly this vocabulary too. The flood language on that tablet is not invented. It is sitting there in the clay, waiting 3,000 years to be read correctly. But here, gently, is where the story has to settle rather than soar. Directions to Noah's Ark is a phrase built for headlines, not for careful scholarship. What Finkel actually offered was a cautious reading, a plausible connection between a damaged text and an old flood tradition, presented the way careful scholars present things with room left for doubt. The press took that caution and sharpened it into a treasure map. What the tablet's reverse side more likely represents is not a set of coordinates for an archaeological expedition at all, but something quieter and, if you let it be, more interesting. A description of the mythic edges of the world woven in among practical geography, the way religion and geography were never really separated for the people who made this thing in the first place. The Nagu were not necessarily meant to be found. They were meant to be understood as existing out past the water at the place where the map's knowledge, and perhaps the world itself, came to an end. Because that, in the end, is what this small clay circle is actually for. Not navigation, not the discovery of a lost boat in a lost mountain range. It is a picture of how one people in one city, on the banks of one river, understood their own place in existence. Babylon sits in that rectangle just north of centre, not because a surveyor measured it there, but because to the person who made this map, Babylon was where the world made sense, where the gods had ordered things properly, where the river ran the way rivers were supposed to run. Everything past that, the neighbouring cities, the distant regions, the ring of bitter water, and finally those strange triangular lands pointing off into the dark beyond it, all of it radiates outward from that one certainty. We are here, this is the centre, and out there, past the water, is the edge of what we can know. That is the real discovery hiding in this tablet, and it has nothing to do with an ark resting on a mountainside. It is that the very first time a human being tried to draw the whole world, the map wasn't really about geography at all. It was about belonging. Every one of us, if you think about it quietly enough tonight, still carries some version of that same small circle. A place we consider the centre, the people and streets and rooms that feel like the middle of everything. And somewhere past that, in every direction, a ring of bitter water we have never crossed, and beyond it shapes we can only guess at. The Babylonians simply pressed theirs into clay, and it survived long enough for us to still be able to hold it up to the light. From here, though, the story of ancient map-making is about to change its character entirely. The tablet we have just left you with is a symbol, a belief shaped like a world, but not every map from this deep, distant past was content to stop at symbol and centre and mythic edge. Somewhere else, in a very different kingdom, on a very different material, someone was about to make a map meant to be walked. A real map of a real stretch of desert, painted not to explain where the world ended, but to show, quite plainly, where the road went, and what kind of stone was waiting for you when you got there. That road, it turns out, still exists. You could walk it today, if you knew where to look, out in the eastern desert of Egypt, between the Nile and the Red Sea, where the land goes dry and pale and folds itself into long, cracked valleys the ancient Egyptians called wadis. And the map of it survives too, not in a museum in London this time, but in Turin, in northern Italy, in a quiet institution called the Museo Egizio, the oldest museum in the world devoted entirely to Egypt. There behind glass lies a stretch of papyrus that scholars simply call the Turin Papyrus Map. And once you understand what it actually is, you may find it even harder to sleep than the flood tablet did. Not because it is strange, but because it is so completely, quietly competent. Picture the year. Not 700 BCE this time, but further back still to around 1150 BCE, deep in Egypt's 20th dynasty, during the third year on the throne of a pharaoh named Ramesses IV. Ramesses IV is not one of the famous ones. He is not Tutankhamun. He is not Ramesses the Great. He reigned only a handful of years in a period when Egypt's golden age was already beginning to dim at the edges. But in that third year of his reign he did something enormously practical. He sent an expedition, a large one, by some accounts more than 8,000 men, out into the desert to gather stone. Not just any stone, a dark, prized material called Bekin stone, a fine-grained greywacke that Egyptian sculptors used to carve the faces of gods and kings, the kind of stone that could hold a polish and catch torchlight in a tomb 3,000 years after the sculptor set down his chisel. And to gather that stone, someone needed to know exactly where it was, how to get a work crew there, and how to get it back. That is what this papyrus was for, not glory, not the edge of the world. Logistics. Picture for a moment what an expedition like that actually meant. 8,000 men, some accounts suggest, moving out of the fertile green ribbon of the Nile Valley and into a desert that offered nothing on its own. No food growing anywhere, no shade worth the name. Water only where you had already found it and marked it, and if you had not marked it correctly, or if the man leading the column misjudged the distance between one well and the next, people did not simply turn back and try again tomorrow. They died in the sand. A mining expedition on this scale was not an adventure. It was a piece of state machinery, as carefully provisioned as an army. And like an army, it needed maps the way an army needs them, not to inspire, but to survive the march. We believe we even know, or can reasonably guess, the name of the man who painted it. A scribe named Amenakte, son of Ipui, who lived in a small walled village called Deir el-Medina, tucked into the hills across the Nile from the great tombs of the Valley of the Kings. Deir el-Medina was not a village of farmers or soldiers. It was a village of specialists built to house the artisans, painters, and scribes who carved and decorated the pharaoh's tombs, generation after generation, a community of literate, skilled people living in the shadow of the desert they served. Amenakte was one of its most prominent scribes, a man whose handwriting scholars have learned to recognize across dozens of surviving documents. And somewhere in his working life, he appears to have taken up a brush and painted a picture of a road. Picture the papyrus itself, reconstructed from its fragments today. It stretches to roughly 2.8 meters long, nearly 9 feet, a long, low strip meant to be unrolled and studied, not admired from across a room. It was acquired for the Museo Egizio in the early 1800s, part of a wave of Egyptian antiquities that made their way into European collections in that period, and it has sat in Turin ever since, patiently waiting for people to notice exactly how strange, in the best possible way, it actually is. Here is what it shows. About 15 kilometers of a real place, the Wadi Hammamat, a dry riverbed valley slicing through the eastern desert on the route between the Nile and the Red Sea. On the papyrus you can pick out the wadis themselves, painted as winding pale channels, and the hills rising between them in soft brown mounds. You can find the quarry where the Beacon stone was cut. You can find a gold mining settlement, complete with tiny painted huts where the miners actually lived, packed close together against the heat. There is a well marked, because in that country, marking where the water was could be the difference between an expedition that came home and one that did not. And there is a small temple, a quiet place of worship set down among the huts and the stone, because even a mining camp in the middle of nowhere needed somewhere to make an offering before the work began. Now sit with that for a moment. A map made 3,150 years ago, showing a well, a work camp, a quarry and a shrine, laid out with enough care that a scribe back in the Nile Valley could look at it and understand exactly how an expedition into that desert would actually unfold. That alone would be remarkable. It would already be, by a wide margin, one of the oldest maps of a real, specific, walkable place ever found. But here is the part that quietly lifts this papyrus out of every map you have heard about tonight so far. The part that should not, by any reasonable expectation of the ancient world, exist. It is in colour, and the colour is not decoration. Look closely at the painted ground on this papyrus, and you notice the artist did not use one shade of brown for the desert and call it finished. Different patches of ground carry different colours, deliberately, consistently, patch by patch along the route. Pink for one kind of rock, black for another. A particular shading for loose gravel, a different one for solid stone. This is not an artist varying his palette for visual interest. This map is telling you, in paint, what the ground beneath your feet is actually made of, valley by valley, hill by hill, all the way along 15 kilometers of real desert. Say that a little more plainly, because it deserves to be said plainly. Someone, working for an Egyptian mining expedition 11 centuries before the birth of Christ, painted a document that distinguishes rock types by colour correctly across a real landscape. That is not simply a map. That is, as far as anyone has ever found, the oldest surviving geological map on Earth. A geological way of seeing the world, a habit of mind that treats the ground itself as something with a structure worth recording, roughly 3,000 years before geology existed as anything you could call a science. And here is the part I want you to hold on to, especially gently tonight, because this whole night has walked you through map after map where the wonder needed a caveat attached to it. Piri races frozen south that bent, on closer look, into an ordinary coastline. Oronteus finds continent that only matched Antarctica if you rotated it, shifted its pole and shrank it down. Boach's split continent that was reasoned, not remembered. Zeno's whole map that turned out plainly to be a lie. Even Babylon's clay circle, so hauntingly close to a treasure map, needed the headlines gently walked back into something quieter. This one does not need that. There is no correction coming. No press exaggeration to deflate. This is simply, verifiably, exactly what it looks like. In 1992, two geologists, James Harrell and Vincent Brown, went out into the eastern desert themselves, papyrus reconstruction in hand, and walked the Wadi Hammamat looking for the ground the ancient scribe had painted. And they found it. The hills lined up. The quarry lined up. The colour-coded rock types on the papyrus matched, with genuine precision, the actual geology sitting under the desert sun 3,000 years later. Not a rough resemblance stretched to fit a theory. A match confirmed on the ground by trained scientists doing the kind of field work this papyrus itself was made to support. Harrell and Brown were not the first to notice the map was unusual. Scholars had puzzled over its details for decades, but they were the ones who finally took it out of the library and set it against the land itself, wadi by wadi, until the fit became undeniable. Because of that work, this small strip of painted reed pulp is now recognized, safely and without asterisk, as the oldest surviving topographical map in the world, and in the same breath, the oldest surviving geological map in the world too. There is no Hapgood here, no forgotten super-civilization waiting in the footnotes, no press release stretching a cautious translation into a headline about buried arks. Nobody needs to rotate this map 20 degrees, or shift its centre 1,000 kilometres, or imagine an ice age that ended 10 million years too early to make the wonder fit. The wonder simply fits the way a key fits a lock it was cut for. That, on its own, might be the strangest thing about it. After 9 maps of impossible-seeming coastlines and rotated poles and half-true headlines, here, finally, is a map that asks you to believe nothing at all except what 2 geologists confirmed with their own boots in the same sand the scribe once stood in. Think about what that means about the people who made it. Not priests interpreting the shape of the cosmos, not a king's court dreaming up a symbolic centre to the universe, a working state with a payroll, and a quota of stone to fill, and a road crew to feed and water in a desert that could kill you in an afternoon if you misjudged where the well was. Somewhere in the machinery of that state sat a scribe, trained not in myth, but in observation, who understood that the difference between one patch of hillside and the next, the difference between good Beacon stone and ordinary gravel, between where the gold-bearing rock sat and where it did not, was worth painting in careful distinguishing colour. An ancient administration that thought, in its quiet, unglamorous way, like a mining engineer. A map made for no reason grander than making sure the stone and the gold actually made it home. There is something almost tender about that, if you let yourself feel it. Not a monument to a god, not a claim about the edge of creation. Just a scribe named Amenacte, son of Ipui, sitting somewhere in a village of artisans across the river from the Valley of the Kings, mixing his pigments with enough care that a document he painted for a single mining season would still be legible and still be true 31 centuries later, when 2 geologists finally walked out into that same desert to check his work. 9 maps now, carried across 5,000 years of ink and clay and dye and painted reed, from gazelle skin to heart-shaped parchment to a small clay circle from Sippar to this long quiet strip of Egyptian papyrus. And each one, in its own way, has turned out to be a story about how far the human mind was willing to reach. Whether toward a coastline it had only heard about, or a god at the centre of everything, or simply the honest colour of the ground beneath its own feet. But there is one map left, and it is, by a wide, almost uncomfortable margin, the oldest thing you will hear about tonight. Older than Egypt's stone cutters, older than Babylon's clay, older by centuries than either one. It was not painted, it was carved, cut into solid rock by people who left no names behind at all, in a part of Bronze Age Europe you would not expect a map to survive from, and then, in a final strange turn even this night has not yet given you, it was buried, placed deliberately into the wall of a grave, and left there in the dark for a very long time indeed, long enough that when it finally came back into the light, it had already been forgotten once for more than 100 years, all over again. Picture the year 1900. Not in Egypt this time, not in Mesopotamia, but in Brittany, in the far west of France, in a quiet, damp region called Finistère, a name that means more or less the end of the earth. An archaeologist named Paul du Châtelier is out digging, as he has done for years, into the low grassy mounds that dot this landscape, the burial places of people who lived and died long before Rome, long before Gaul had a name anyone wrote down. And in a small hillside spot called Saint-Bélec, he opens a Bronze Age grave. A cist, they call it, a stone box built to hold a body, and one of the walls of that stone box is not the flat, unremarkable slab you would expect. It is covered in lines, grooves and hollows and long deliberate cuts, worked by hand into a slab of schist, a fine-grained stone that splits, if you know how to work it, into flat, even sheets, the kind of material a Bronze Age craftsman could actually carve with a hard point and a patient hand. Du Châtelier notices, of course. He is a careful man, one of the more prolific excavators of prehistoric Brittany in his day, responsible for opening hundreds of burial mounds across this same stretch of countryside. He writes the stone up, in the dry, thorough language of 19th century archaeology, as an engraved slab of unknown purpose, sketches it, and has it hauled away to his own home, a chateau nearby for safekeeping, the way a certain kind of 19th century gentleman scholar simply kept the things he dug up. And then, very quietly, almost gently, everybody stops thinking about it. Here is where this map does something no other map tonight has done. It does not simply survive, it disappears twice. The first disappearance happened before it was ever dug up at all. Whoever built that grave, whoever needed a fourth wall for a stone coffin, took a slab that already had lines cut into it, purpose already spent, meaning already, it seems, finished, and broke it into pieces to make the walls of a dead man's resting place. A slab that had once stood for something was pulled down, fractured and turned face in, into the dark, holding up the dirt around a body. That is the first burial, not of a person, of an idea. The second disappearance took 114 years. Du Châtelier's find went into storage, into a cellar, in among the crates and the shelves of a private collection, the way so many 19th century discoveries did, catalogued once, in someone's careful handwriting, and then simply left. Scholars moved on to other sites, other centuries, other questions. Generations passed. The chateau stood quietly through 2 world wars and everything after them, and the slab sat down there in the dark a second time. This time not buried in soil, but buried in paperwork, in the ordinary, unglamorous forgetting that swallows even the objects we were careful enough to save in the first place. Nobody hid it. Nobody meant to lose it. It was simply set down in a cellar, and the world moved on without it for well over a century. It was not until 2014 that a team of researchers working systematically back through old regional collections with fresh eyes opened a crate in that same cellar and found it again, exactly where Du Châtelier had left it, still bearing his own century-old museum label, and realized that nobody now alive had any real idea what they were actually looking at. What they were looking at, once they laid it flat and studied it properly, was a slab of schist about 2.2 meters long, roughly 7 feet, carved sometime around 1900 BCE. Sit with that number for a moment, because it is the number that changes everything about tonight. 1900 years before the birth of Christ, almost 4,000 years old. That makes it a contemporary roughly of the Nebra sky disk, that small bronze disk from Germany with its gold sun and stars. One of the most famous objects of the entire European Bronze Age, older than Egypt's papyrus map by more than 7 centuries, older than Babylon's clay circle by well over 1,000 years. This slab predates writing itself in this part of the world. Whoever carved it left behind no name, no language we can read, no story of their own in their own words, only the stone. And here, finally, is the hook that this whole night has been quietly building toward. In 2021, a team of researchers led by Clément Nicolas and Yvon Payer published a study proposing something remarkable about those lines. Not that they are decoration, not that they are simply abstract, ceremonial marks, the kind of geometric pattern Bronze Age Europe carved onto standing stones all across the continent. They argue carefully, rigorously, in a peer-reviewed paper, that the marks on the Saint-Bélec Slab form a map, a real one, of a real place. Picture it laid flat in front of you the way those researchers did, a network of engraved lines, branches and forks and rejoins, and when you set it beside a modern map of the region, the lines fall with startling consistency along the paths of actual rivers and streams. Specifically, the Odette River Valley, the waterway that still runs through this part of Finistère today, its tributaries branching outward across the land almost exactly the way the carved lines branch across the stone. Small motifs, dots and enclosures, and tiny repeated symbols sit scattered across the surface in places that, the researchers argue, correspond to real burial mounds, real fenced enclosures, real fields that people worked or worshipped at or were laid to rest beneath 4,000 years ago. Nicholas and Paella calculate that the area depicted covers something like 30 by 21 kilometres of actual Breton landscape, and that the correspondence between carved line and real terrain runs to roughly 80%. 8 out of every 10 features on that stone appear to line up with something that is still in some form out there on the ground today. If that reading holds, and holds carefully, this is the oldest known map of a real, specific place anywhere in Europe, quite possibly the oldest one anywhere in the world. Now, hold that claim the way you have learned to hold every claim tonight. Gently and with both hands. This is not a settled fact carved into the textbooks the way the Turin Papyrus now safely is. This is a strong, careful, peer-reviewed hypothesis, and the honest way to say it is exactly the way the researchers themselves say it. The slab is argued to be a map. Not proven beyond question, argued by serious scholars on the strength of a genuinely striking correspondence between stone and territory. That distinction matters, and it is worth sitting with rather than rushing past, because it is the distinction that has quietly separated the wonder from the wishful thinking all night long. And if you accept that argument, even provisionally, it changes what kind of object you are looking at, because this is very likely not a navigation chart. Nobody was going to carry a slab of stone weighing well over 100 kilograms down a Bronze Age footpath to find their way home, the way you might fold a papyrus or roll a gazelle skin under one arm. This is something closer to a declaration, carved once and meant to stay exactly where it was set. A cadastral map in the language modern land offices still use for it, meaning a map not of coastlines or currents, but of ownership, of who holds which valley, which stream, which cluster of burial mounds where the ancestors lie, which fenced enclosure belongs to which household, which fields feed which hearth. Read this way, the Saint-Bélec Slab is not a tool for travel at all. It is a chieftain's territory, laid out in stone for anyone who could read it, a Bronze Age statement that says, in perhaps the oldest cartographic language anyone has ever found, this land and everyone buried in it and everyone farming it belongs to me and to whoever comes after me, which makes what happened to it afterward feel less like an accident and more like a message. Somebody broke that slab. Somebody took a stone that had once declared a territory, that had perhaps stood upright somewhere for a generation or more, catching the light, and shattered it into pieces, and then buried those pieces, face down inside the walls of a grave, where the carved lines pointed only into packed earth and could never again be read by anyone standing above the ground. Archaeologists who study this kind of Bronze Age power and its symbols have a phrase for what this looks like, the deliberate killing of a monument. Not simple thrifty reuse of a convenient flat stone lying around, though it was certainly that too in the most practical sense, but something closer to a ritual undoing, a stone punished almost for what it once meant, at just the moment perhaps, when the authority it represented came to an end, when a chieftain died or a dynasty fell or a rival territory swallowed this one whole. A map, quite literally, buried with the dead, because whatever it once claimed no longer had a claimant left standing to defend it. 10 maps now. You have travelled across almost 4,000 years tonight to arrive at this one, and if you let yourself look back down that long corridor of ink and clay and papyrus and stone, you may notice something that was true the entire time, hiding in plain sight under every single one of them. Piri Reis, on his gazelle skin in Istanbul, was not remembering a lost world. He was stitching together 20 borrowed charts, reaching as far as a lost map of Columbus's own hand could carry him, to draw a coastline he had never sailed. Oronteus Fine, in his elegant heart-shaped world, was not copying a survey nobody could have made. He was reasoning from symmetry, certain a great southern land had to balance the globe, and drawing it into being out of pure conviction. Philippe Bouache, in Paris, was doing the same thing with better instincts, deducing a divided, ice-buried continent from what he understood correctly, about how icebergs carve from frozen coasts. Niccolo Zeno was reaching for something else entirely, reaching for his own family's pride, and telling a lie so well crafted it sent real ships chasing phantom islands for 100 years. The scholars of Joseon Korea were reaching across an empire that was not their own, gathering into one silk map the accumulated sight of Arab sailors and Chinese cartographers and Mongol roads they themselves never rode. Martin Waldseemüller was reaching past the edge of Vespucci's reports, past everything Ptolemy had ever taught him, to guess at an ocean no European had yet confirmed. Even the Dieppe mapmakers, chasing a phantom Australia out of misread Portuguese charts, were reaching, however clumsily, toward a land they wanted very badly to already exist. The priests of Babylon, scratching their small clay circle, were reaching toward the edge of the knowable world and drawing themselves carefully into its centre. The scribe Amenachte, mixing his pigments in a village of artisans across the Nile from the Valley of the Kings, was reaching toward the honest colour of the ground beneath his own feet, so that a stranger reading his map a season later would know exactly where to dig. And now at the very bottom of all of it, 4,000 years down, past every parchment and every papyrus, past even Babylon's clay, a Bronze Age hand, whose name you will never know, whose language nobody now speaks, whose face no one will ever picture with any confidence, sat somewhere in a valley in what is now called Brittany, and reached toward the rivers and hills of home, and scratched them into stone, so that the shape of a life and a claim and a people would still be legible after. That hand itself had gone still and turned eventually to dust. 10 maps, 10 different reasons a human being once looked at the world or the small specific part of it they could actually reach, and decided it was worth holding on to. Not one of them, in the end, required a lost civilization to explain it, and not one of them needed to. What they required every single time was something quieter, and somehow larger, a mind reaching out past the edge of its own horizon, again and again, in gazelle skin and cordiform parchment, and painted reed pulp, and fired clay, and carved schist, for 4,000 years, refusing to let the unknown simply stay unknown. Some of those reaches were honest, and some were vain, and one at least was a lie dressed up beautifully enough to fool the world for 100 years. But underneath all of it runs the same current, patient and unbroken, from a scribe's brush in Deir el-Medina to a chieftain's stone-cutter beside a river in Brittany, the simple, stubborn human refusal to leave the world unmapped, unclaimed, unknown, and perhaps that more than any coastline or continent or buried river valley is the real map this whole night has been quietly tracing all along. Not where the land was, where we, all of us, across every one of those 4,000 years, were willing to go looking for it. So let yourself rest there for a moment, at the bottom of all of it, with that thought settling over you like a blanket pulled up in the dark. 10 maps, 4,000 years, and not one of them, in the end, needed a lost world to explain it. That was the fear, wasn't it? The thing that made each of these maps feel, at first, like a small crack in the story we tell ourselves about the past. The worry that someone somewhere impossibly knew, that a coastline drawn before anyone sailed it, or a continent sketched beneath ice no eye had seen, could only mean that some vanished and forgotten people had been here first, wiser than we ever guessed, and then simply gone. It is a seductive fear. It has sold a great many books. But watch what happened, gently, every single time we leaned in close enough to actually look. The impossibility did not harden into proof. It dissolved. It softened again and again into something quieter, and somehow in the softening into something far more moving than a secret ever could have been. You already know the whole list by now, map by map, reach by reach. Not one of them remembered. Every one of them reasoned or borrowed or guessed, or, in Zeno's case, lied, and then simply hoped the world would turn out to agree. None of it required a miracle. What it required every time was a mind. A person sitting somewhere in the lamplight or the desert sun or the damp green quiet of a Breton valley, looking at the small piece of the world they could actually reach, and refusing stubbornly, tenderly, to leave the rest of it blank. That is the real marvel of tonight, and it is a warmer one than any lost civilization. The wonder was never that someone impossibly knew. The wonder is how far the human mind has always been willing to reach, past the very edge of what it could see, and to draw down what it found there in ink and clay and paint and stone, so that the rest of us, drifting here in the dark so many centuries later, could still follow the line of that reaching all the way home. If you have enjoyed travelling that long corridor tonight, if some small map or some quiet reveal made you feel, just for a moment, a little more gently connected to all the hands that came before yours, then it would mean a great deal if you'd let us know. A like on this video if you're the sort of person who still has the wakefulness left to tap it. Helps more people find these stories in the quiet hours when they need them most. And if you have the words in you, leave a comment. I read them. I love to read them, especially this. Tell me where in the world you are listening from tonight. We asked right at the very beginning, all those hours and all those maps ago, and it never stops being lovely to see, because when the comments come in, they draw a map of their own. A little one, scattered across the whole dark globe. Someone in a city apartment with the window cracked to the summer air. Someone in a farmhouse where the nearest light is a mile off. Someone in a bed on the other side of the planet where it is already tomorrow. All of you out there in the night at the same time, listening to the same soft voice tell the same old stories. It is, if you think about it, its own kind of ancient map. People, scattered across the earth, marking down exactly where they are. So mark yourself down if you'd like to, and if you'd care to hear more nights like this one, you're always welcome to subscribe, and I'll be here with another story whenever you next need somewhere soft to put your mind down. There's no hurry at all. It will be there in the morning, the way these things always are. Because that, in the end, is the quietest lesson of all these old maps. They are patient. Every one of them outlasted the hand that made it by centuries, by thousands of years. The gazelle's skin waited 400 years in a palace for someone to look again. The Breton stone waited in the dark twice over, buried in soil and then buried in paperwork, and it was in no hurry at all. They kept, they waited. They held their shape while empires rose and fell above them, and forgot they were even there, and they are still here now, laid flat under glass in quiet museums, holding the world as it was seen by eyes that closed a very long time ago. So you can let go of it now. All of it. The frozen souths and the phantom islands, the clay circle with the whole world scratched inside its ring, the painted desert and the map of a river valley carved by a hand whose name will never be known. You don't have to hold any of it any more tonight. The maps will keep it for you. That is what they have always been for. The world is very old. Older than any of these maps. Older than any name written on them. Older than we can really hold in a single waking thought, which is perhaps why it is easier to feel it here at the soft edge of sleep than anywhere else. And it is patient with us, It has watched every one of these small, brave, reaching hands try to draw it down to a size we could carry, and it has held still and let us try, and forgiven every place we got it wrong. The horizon you couldn't quite see past tonight will still be there in the morning. It always is. It waited 4,000 years for the last hand that tried to map it, and it can wait a single night for you. There is nothing left out there in the dark that you need to find before you rest. The coastlines are drawn, the rivers are traced. Every map that needed making has for tonight been made, so let your eyes close now if they haven't already drifted shut somewhere back among the maps. Let the last of the day loosen its hold. Let the names go soft and the numbers go quiet, and the long line of all those patient, reaching hands carry you gently down into the dark. The world is very old and very large, and it has been mapped for now as far as it needs to be. You can set it down. You can rest, sleep well, wherever in the wide and ancient world you are. The horizon will keep, and it will still be there, faithfully, in the morning.